everyone, Alexa Dunn here, and it has been way too long since I have done any kind of bookish content, book reviews, but I've been reading. So this is your Monster Celebrity Memoir Wrap-Up. Every celebrity memoir I read over the last 18 months to 2 years that I just haven't talked about yet. The good news is, because we know I always go a little bit long-winded, is it's been so long since I've read some of these. Hopefully I'm able to give a roughly coherent, quick summary of my thoughts on these so we can power through them with some fun, in-depth thoughts on a select few as usual. And I'll tell you up front, I might have some potentially controversial thoughts about a few of these big celebrity memoirs that were huge bestsellers that everyone loves. You know, this is one of my favorite genres, so the bar is just really high for me. And accordingly, one of these is a reread that I, got that itch, reread, but haven't covered on my channel before because I originally read it such a long time ago. So I'm gonna give you all the thoughts, all the recs. Let's jump in. Celebrity Memoir, Monster Wrap-Up. Also of note, I read pretty much all of these on audio, which I always love because so often the celebrity themselves reads it, which I really think enhances the experience, which is definitely the case for the first one, which I just finished, Miss Memory Lane by Colton Haynes. I was not a huge Teen Wolf fan or an Arrow fan, not really shows I watched in depth, but I've been aware of Colton Haynes. It was a really big deal when he came out a few years ago, and I picked up his memoir after seeing him in a YouTube video doing an interview about it, and I am so glad I did. This one is beautifully written. If Colton wrote it himself, thumbs up, or if he worked with a talented ghostwriter, thumbs up either way. There was some just beautiful language and imagery in this book about his childhood growing up in Kansas and Texas and moving around, and his pretty messed up home life and parents and some really awful stuff that happened to him as a kid. Content warning for this memoir for childhood sexual assault. Nothing graphic, but emotionally graphic. He's so open and raw about both his feelings at the time with a bit of context of how he understands what it really was. But you get that kind of glimpse into what his literal child mind thought and felt about the person who he trusted, who did this to him. A series of people who took advantage of him. And he really examines how it affected his psyche to this day, and how, going into the industry, becoming a model and an actor, and how he kind of seeks validation and love from people. Accordingly, I just thought it was a beautiful memoir with a lot of emotional depth, emotional maturity. Colton doesn't specifically mention it, but he must be in therapy and doing the work, because it's like you see someone who's gone through some terrible things and reached a really low and is looking back on it in a really thoughtful, mature way. Even if you don't really know who Colton Haynes is specifically, I think that his perspective as someone who was gay and out in his life and then went back into the closet for his career because he was told by everyone around him, managers, Hollywood, etc., you can't be gay and be successful, and kind of how he spiraled from there and then came out the other end. Just a really beautiful memoir, and actually a case where I didn't mind that the vast majority of it is his life before he became famous and the early days of modeling and getting into acting. It's not super heavy on kind of the fun anecdotes of after getting into Hollywood and making it. A tiny bit of name dropping, but nothing heavy. But in this case, I felt so emotionally connected to him as a person and his story and his journey. I didn't care. There have been a couple celebrity memoirs where they focus on that part and it's kind of boring, and it's not what you read the memoir for necessarily. You want the kind of fun anecdotes, but they talk a lot about their childhoods. But this is a case where honestly it's the reverse. I'm really glad I read this, and I highly recommend it if you also like those very vulnerable, emotional type celebrity memoirs. Coming right out the gate with one of my potentially controversial opinions, yeah, I read The Woman in Me, Britney Spears' memoir, and I have mixed feelings about it. I have talked to and seen online some other people who feel similarly to me, but this was a huge talking point. Everyone read it. have to say, Michelle Williams doing the audiobook, her voice was like a feather bed that I sunk into. I felt like engulfed in her warmth and her arms. Beautiful audiobook narration. Did an amazing job with it. The actual memoir itself, it's also a quick listen. I'm not saying don't read it. I mean, read it if you want to, but the thing for me, there's an aspect of voyeurism in reading celebrity memoirs that you always have to grapple with. And there's a spectrum in terms of like authors who write them, celebrities who write them, and they're at the right point in their life to write them, and you feel safe and okay being a voyeur into their life and their memoir. Like with Colton Haynes, he's doing that work and he's sharing awful traumatic things that happened to him, but you know that he's healthily processing and sharing because he's at a point where it's the right point to share. With Britney, I didn't really feel that way. I felt kind of gross because I'm not sure it was the right time for this book. Free Britney, all of that stuff. She needs to do what she needs to do. But there was a lot in this book that felt very missing reasons for me, like gaps. Things where she was telling it from her perspective, but I kept having a million questions of like, trying to connect A to B and put things together. I think there's a lot missing because Britney herself completely understandably hasn't fully processed everything and or may never be ready to speak of certain things in certain ways. And the question with every celebrity memoir, which I have said many times in my wrap-ups on this channel, does anyone owe us that? That's always going to be the question. But for me, that led to some frustrations in parts of the memoir where I just knew that there had to be missing context, and I had a lot of questions about what went down. But also on the other hand, not upset I monetarily supported Britney by listening to her memoir because she's out there trying to put her life back together. So we all participated in this aspect of voyeurism that she did invite us to do, but I just, I hope genuinely that Britney is okay. And there were aspects of the memoir that I was a little bit uncomfortable reading. That's kind of, it was kind of a 3-star for me. Yeah. Next, I read a pair of also looky-loo, celebrity-ish memoirs that I was kind of on. Ultimately, am I the target audience? They actually both suffered from very similar things. I read Counting the Cost and Becoming Free Indeed by 2 slightly different Duggar siblings. And yes, I did just have to look up on Goodreads which was by which sibling. I'm so sorry. Duggar siblings who all have J names that are similar. They're also very close in age. So Counting the Cost was by Jill Duggar. So I read this one first. It was definitely the buzzier of the two. It's also the more accessible of the two, which I will talk about a bit. Context. Have I ever watched 19 Kids and Counting in the deep past? Yes, I have. Am I religious at all? No, I'm really the opposite of religious. But do I watch Fun Day Fridays? Yes. Did I watch Shiny Happy People? Yes. And was I fascinated by this? Yes. But it's also definitely an example of someone who is deconstructing, though she pointedly does not use that word. Neither of the sisters do. And you are with her mid deconstructing her childhood and her religion and the belief system, and she's transitioned to another one. Both of them have. They're still religious, just different flavor of religious. It ended up being a little mid for me for 2 reasons. One, Jill definitely worked with a ghostwriter and the writing was fine, but there's a pitfall when certain celebrities narrate their own memoir, if public figures narrate their own memoir. Some of them are just not gifted at reading aloud, and they have this like stiff, awkward, robotic voice almost, and I'm sure the producers were heroes and tried to coach them in how to like read an audiobook and turn it into more of a performance. But her cadence of speaking, both of the sisters in both of these audiobooks, it really frustrated me like a lot. Probably because it was mixed with like fundy speak. You know, there's the joke on TikTok that like, you know, certain women, Christian women, have a very specific cadence to their voices, so maybe it was a little bit of that. But I did find the actual listening experience a little grating. So to that end, it felt like it dragged a little and it affected my enjoyment. Also, I did watch the Funny Fridays video about the memoir before I read the memoir, and it spoiled some things, so maybe that also kind of tempered my reading experience, but it was just very mid for me, and I absolutely got the impression it's a kind of watch this space kind of thing where I want to see what Jill writes in 10 years or 15 years, but she's very raw and very in it right now. It's worth reading, and I preferred it to the two from the sisters that I read, but it was still kind of mid for me. And I'm just generally not into a lot of Jesus talk in general. It had a lot of Jesus talk, but not as much Jesus talk as Becoming Free Indeed. That's the Jinger Duggar one. And Becoming Free Indeed is basically like, I am new flavor Christian, fundamentalist question mark, I don't know. Let me tell you about it. That one is like Jill's is a proper kind of memoir and gets into her deconstructing. She doesn't call it that. Ginger's is more like, I found the true faith, the true gospel. What I grew up with was bad. And she does talk a little bit about it, though very kindly. But let me tell you about Jesus. She has a very specific way of saying Jesus. If you are Christian, you might like it a lot more than I did. I'm not Christian. I'm not religious. So to a point, it just wasn't for me. I'm not the target audience essentially for that one. It is definitely more for people who are also maybe disentangling or deconstructing faith and kind of staying within faith as part of that journey. So hers was just drier. It had a lot more scripture. I barely remember it except that my impression of this is too Jesus-y for me. So those are the two Duggar memoirs in a nutshell. Lots of Jesus, little less Jesus in Jill's, a little more tea in Jill's. Yeah. Next is one of my favorite memoirs I read last year, which is Paris the Memoir, Paris Hilton's memoir. Fantastic example of, similar to Colton Haynes, she's been doing the work. You can tell she's had so much therapy, and her memoir really surprised me because yes, it's about Paris Hilton and her life, and you get some Paris Hilton-y stuff, but really the bulk of it is about how Paris was sent to a teen wilderness camp, one of those reprogramming camps for teens, where she suffered really horrific abuse, and she's become an advocate to put a stop to these things. She's been in different documentaries about it, but her memoir really digs into that and how it affected her. She also talks a lot about being diagnosed with ADHD and like those sorts of things. So you get some of the expected Paris Hilton stuff, but really what makes the memoir so fascinating is she's really smart, she's really thoughtful, and she is truly revealing parts of herself that weren't part of her public persona. She reflects a little bit on said public persona. I'd say that there are a few places where I went, Paris, where she says something flippant about how like it was no big, and I'm like, you drove the culture and not always in good ways. Still love you. Love this book. But there were a couple moments of bestie. But overall, a very good memoir. Very surprising because of, you know, this thing that she kept a secret for a very long time and is now talking openly about and doing advocacy for. It was a really impactful memoir. I would read it again. And yeah, it's one I definitely recommend. Next, I read The Beauty of Living Twice by Sharon Stone. I'll say that I really wanted to love this, and I went in assuming I would absolutely love it. And it is a solid and good memoir. Sharon Stone definitely had some surprising aspects of her life, and it's beautifully written. She is a smart, she's a smart cookie and a tough cookie. She's a very good writer. It's just the stuff about her childhood, and she talks about having a stroke and, you know, her medical complications, almost dying, the beauty of living twice. And so it's a very interesting memoir, but in kind of the range of all the different ones I've read, it kind of ended up falling in the middle for me. Definitely read it if you're interested, because she is an interesting person and it is well written. It's just not a top tier one for me, but incredibly solid. Similarly, I also read Love, Pamela, which also fell kind of into the mid-range for me. Similarly, that's kind of where Love, Pamela fell for me. And again, amazingly written. Pamela Anderson is really smart and incredibly talented, and absolutely I loved reading it and also watching the documentary that she made to kind of, you know, do this reassessment on so many of these women from the 80s and the 90s who were underestimated in a lot of ways, especially because they were over-sexualized. She's just really thoughtful and has an incredibly compelling voice. The first half, I was sucked in. It was one where, you know, she did a ton on her childhood, but I was fully engaged. I was ready to give this memoir 5 stars in the first half. But she ends up really kind of skimming through the rest of it, and it's not so much that I need all of the dirty details of all the celebrity stuff, but she definitely is one where you do expect something about, you know, the Hollywood stuff a little, and she even lampshades that, you know, as we go through life, we tend to like focus on the good and remember the good and kind of forget a lot of the nitty gritty. Yes, but it means she skipped a lot of it in the memoir, and it was an intentional choice. She really is lampshading that she made an intentional choice in this memoir to focus on all the good stuff, but it made it kind of a mid-read for me because ultimately it just feels a tiny bit shallow because of that. Again, what does anyone owe us when we're reading a celebrity memoir is the question. This is what Pam chose to write. I do recommend reading it because it is fast and quick, and what is there is pretty good, but it's not going to be one of those all-timers. It skims some of the emotional, you know, depth of certain things a little bit too much, but a woman who's been exploited to that level, can we really ask her to like bear even more of her soul and like get into the weeds on it with us? Especially, you know, she's such a fantastic mother. She talks so lovingly about her children and her life and kind of her priorities. I think that's another reason she chose not to talk about certain things in certain ways, because it's, you know, out of respect to her children and the life that she has built for herself. It is good. It just ended up being mid for me. 3 stars. Speaking of bearing all, this brings us to Spare by Prince Harry. Like everyone else, I read this immediately. We're all like, oh, T, audiobook. Lovely audiobook voice. He's got that sexy British thing going on. But, oh, Spare. There's an entire chapter about his Todger. He got frostnip. It's a whole thing. Why is there a whole chapter on it? I have questions. Mostly I have questions for his ghostwriter. I want to buy his ghostwriter a drink, who is publicly acknowledged. Not all of these publicly acknowledge the ghostwriters. Harry does, and I actually appreciate that about him. But I'm like, what was it like working with him and realizing he really wanted the frostnip on his member chapter in full, where he just talks about it. He talks about it. Fascinating. Overall, I guess in the grand scheme of things, this one also ended up being mid, but it's also still kind of a fun looky-loo. I'm not saying don't read it, but my overall impression was this book is a hit list. This book has an agenda, and a lot of memoirs do, but this memoir's agenda was, I'm gonna get back at those who have wronged me, and it's his dad and his brother, essentially. But like, there's a thesis and the media. His dad, brother, and the media, and there's a thesis, and he went into it like laying up those dominoes. And are we technically here for it? Yes. But I didn't find it, despite him talking about therapy and Megan and all this kind of stuff, I didn't find it a particularly honestly emotionally open memoir. I think he still has a lot of processing to do, and frankly, because he is a British royal, he may never have the emotional candor we would want, the emotional openness and just perspective on his own life. He still brings a pretty, I mean, he's a former royal. He brings a pretty warped perspective to some of his stories. Like, you're reading it and you're like, sir, this isn't normal. This isn't normal. You're not normal. But he thinks he's normal. I think it says a lot that he's probably one of the most likable royals regardless. I will say, I previously talked about the Palace Papers in a nonfiction wrap-up, one of the few that I posted a year or so ago, where I felt that it was a little bit unfair to Meghan and Harry, and then it came in with a bit of an agenda itself, and felt a little unfair based on what I knew of Harry and Meghan and my perspective on them at the time. And I have to say, having read this memoir from the camel's mouth, is that a phrase? From the horse's mouth? I'm really bad at idiomatic phrases and metaphors. From Harry's mouth himself, telling their love story and about the, their marriage and everything they went through. I understand Tina Brown a little more, and the Palace Papers was probably better than I rated it at the time. I should maybe revise my Goodreads review. I actually see it now. No shade to them, but Spare did make me like them a tiny bit less, which I guess isn't a hot take nowadays. A lot of people like them a little less watching their Netflix special as well. But reading this, I was like, oh, my personal opinion, observation of Harry, and so go into this memoir knowing it, he's pretty basic. He's royal, but he's pretty basic. It's a more or less basic dude who wrote a whole book about his mean daddy and brother and the media screwing him over and over again. And I'm not saying the media didn't screw him over and over again, but sometimes he comes off a little petulant man baby, which is fine. Spare, I don't regret reading it, but unless you're really a looky-loo for royals and current pop culture content, and you want to hear the penis chapter, it's skippable. It's just a skippable. This is actually a streak of celebrity memoirs that are much hyped that I didn't like. We're just gonna keep going. I also read Hello, Molly by Molly Shannon. I did not like this one. It made me feel incredibly uncomfortable. I know why people like it. She seems like a lovely person, really likable, really sweet. The book has moments that are funny, but the book also has so many anecdotes that are not funny at all. And Molly thinks they're hilarious and cute. And I was reading it in horror going, that was an abusive childhood. That was really messed up and wrong. Are you okay, Molly? It's the voyeur thing. I felt like a bad person reading the memoir. I felt like I was party to and participating in someone's narrative of bad things told like they're completely okay. She does have a fascinating origin story, and actually the first 10-20 minutes, I was crying reading this memoir. Very tragically, Molly's baby sister and mother died in a car accident that Molly was in. Her dad was driving, and she and her sister were in the back. Her mom and her baby sister passed away, and so she was raised by her single dad. She and her sister were raised by her single dad, and they had a wacky childhood, lots of stories, but Molly Shannon loved her dad a lot. That comes through in the memoir. And it comes through in all the stories that are frankly insane and not okay on any level. I just felt gross being party to this book. And that is a personal feeling, but if you too have read books like that have made you feel that way and you just don't care, it's like you're getting drinks with a friend, and it did feel like I was getting drinks with a friend, or like a friend you're not necessarily close to and you're getting to know them, and you realize over the course of the conversation they had a messed up childhood and they haven't really processed any of it. And you're sitting there horrified, and you can't say anything, because then you're just going to be like bringing up stuff that's really uncomfortable to bring up to someone you barely know. I'll tell you one of the story that horrified me the most in this book. Her dad used to just dare her and her sister to do things, like very little supervision in their household. They did crazy stuff because her dad was drunk a lot and barely a functional parent and left them alone a lot and lots of crazy stuff. And one time he dared her and a friend of hers when she was 10 years old to go to New York by herself, to sneak on a plane and go to New York. She was like, I bet I can do it. He's like, I bet you can't. They did. They rolled up to the airport. It was a different time. Walked onto a plane and flew to New York. She was in Ohio, I believe. Just flew to New York. Here's the thing. So she gets to New York and they panic because they don't know how to get back, and she calls her dad. He's like, just sneak onto a plane to come back. Or they flew them, or he had to pay to fly them. It was something wild. But she didn't get in trouble for that. He was really proud of her for doing that. I'm like, I don't have words for how you have to read the story. It's bizarre. There's one other story in it where I was just like, this is horrifying. She tells this lark this wonderful story from her early career where her and a good friend launched this elaborate grift scheme to get auditions. I'm not gonna spoil it, but it's a little bit insane. And I came out of the book still really liking Molly Shannon, but really uncomfortable that I read this book. It's not gonna be for everyone. It wasn't for me. That's where we're gonna leave it. Next, I waited so long to film this video that now it's perhaps a little gauche to talk about this book, but I read Friends, Lovers, and a Big Terrible Thing by Matthew Perry, who has since passed away. And I have to say, when I finished the memoir, it was incredibly clear to me he was not actually in recovery. I was worried for him because I really disliked reading his memoir. I was uncomfortable reading his memoir. Every so often this happens. I was uncomfortable in Molly Shannon's for the specific reason I just went over, but I was uncomfortable in Matthew Perry's. Every once in a blue moon this happens with a celebrity memoir. I literally didn't like being in this head. His perspective was uncomfortable. The way that he talked about things and talked about other people, notably women in his memoir, at least, their only function in the memoir, either sex objects, women he slept with, or women who took care of him, like literal nursemaids. Those are the only two roles women had in his, the women he chose to speak about in his memoir had in his life. I'm sure there were other women that maybe he didn't talk about. The way he talked about one of his exes is really gross in the memoir. Really emotionally manipulative, not okay, really uncomfortable to read. And then just, it was uncomfortable to read, again, that feeling like you're participating in something that maybe you're party to something, you're endorsing something by listening that you shouldn't be. And it's really tragic that he has since passed away, because I felt that when he was talking about recovery, and I just got these red flags that I didn't feel that he was okay. And unfortunately, it seems he likely relapsed and he passed away. And it's very sad that he passed away, but my God, I hated this memoir. It's one of my most unliked memoirs I've probably ever read in my life. I generally don't recommend it. It was uncomfortable to be inside his head. It also was really uneven with the writing in weird ways. The first half was so clearly ghostwritten, even though he insisted he was a genius who wrote it. A lot of ego. But I actually got really similar vibes from the first half as from Spare, and I seriously wonder if it was the same ghostwriter. So the writing in the first half was really beautiful and lyrical and had some wonderful imagery and metaphors, but then it started kind of devolving the more in the weeds it got, the deeper it got, and I could almost feel a transition to Matthew doing the majority of the writing. I think essentially in the likely ghostwriting / editing process, they made sure the first part was kind of a banger and like really polished to hook people in, or also possibly he might not have remembered his childhood as well, and I'm sure whoever worked with him did research to kind of like texturize those parts of the book. But then as it kept going on, it was more and more very clearly him, and that's when the voice got more and more uncomfortable. It was repetitive, and the writing just devolved into the book. The first part is good, and then it's like a barrel rolling down a hill and breaking apart as it rolls down the hill. In short, I was not the biggest fan, and I honestly would skip it. I think it'll be even sadder and more uncomfortable to read in a slightly different way now that he's passed away. On a more positive note, I read a very breath of fresh air memoir, really low drama, all things considered, just like a nice person who I think is cool, a nice cute little memoir, Dying of Politeness by Geena Davis. If you also like Geena Davis and want to read about her life, it was just a nice little read. Nothing mind-blowing or genre-bending, but I enjoyed it. Specifically, it turns out I have a lot in common with Geena Davis, so just a nice little surprise. She was a high school foreign exchange student, and so was I. And we're both really tall and feminist and a lot. And so I am not an Olympic archer, but I feel like I really like Geena Davis, and if I ran into her in person, maybe we could hang out. It was just a fun book. She gives you some celebrity stories. She's pretty frank about some people who are awful. We stan a queen who calls out bad behavior. She dated Jeff Goldblum. She's in some of the most iconic movies of the 90s. And of course now she does really important advocacy work for representation in media. One aspect I found really interesting, and if this sounds like something you'd be keen to read as well, I recommend it for this in particular. She talks about being diagnosed with ADHD as an adult in her, I think, 40s, and kind of that exploration as an adult in this part of her life. And I thought it was really interesting. So yeah, it ends up being a really interesting memoir of someone who, dying of politeness, indeed, is a very nice and polite person who has some fun anecdotes, and I just liked spending time with her. I also read, this is just kind of, I was on a kick and it's a throwback, and I ended up with slightly mixed feelings on it. I read Dear Fatty by Donne French. I have adored Donne French since I was a kid, like Vicar of Dibley Hive, Rise Up. Like, I grew up on that show. I love that show. Love French and Saunders, and I've just always liked and admire her as a comedian. And this memoir is pretty old at this point. It was published in 2008 and I read it last year, 2022. So I think where it just was kind of ended up being a little mid is that she's talking about things in 2008 and like we know where her life has gone since then. So it's like this uncomfortableness of, oh, they're divorced now, and oh, her daughter is estranged from her as an adult. Just like those sorts of like little things. Still like an interesting memoir. It was interesting to see where she came from. Her father died really tragically when she was a kid. And like that part definitely made me cry. Yeah, this is just one I read. It was kind of like 3 stars. If you also like British comedians and you like Donne French, it's an interesting read, but definitely just feels dated at this point because it was current as of 2008 and it is 2024 now. So just kind of ended up being very mid for me, but not bad. Oh, one thing that did throw me off is she did not read the audiobook. She got a friend of hers to read the audiobook, and I think because it was like too personal, which I respect, but it was also just strange hearing someone else speak in Donne French's voice. Like it sounds like Donne French. The writing is Donne French, but it's not read by Donne French, which is kind of funny. I also read Beyond the Wand by Tom Felton. Again, waiting like tears to make a video. I read it like right when it came out. I also found this one kind of mid. It wasn't bad. It was good. I enjoyed reading it. I recommend reading it if you too like Harry Potter and like Tom Felton, especially coming from fandom. It was fun to kind of read like the other side, but this is definitely one where it felt like half a memoir. I've read ones like this before, and it doesn't make it bad, but it does make it slightly unsatisfying. Essentially, Tom Felton's really young. He's younger than I am, and he's, yes, technically lived a lot of life, but hasn't lived a lot of life. And it goes in directions towards the back half because, he had issues with addiction and he went to rehab. And that is when the memoir got really good. When he really starts talking about rock bottom and going to rehab and pulling himself out of it and really reflecting on himself and a lot of things. I thought, that part was great. The emotional honesty. And it wasn't really great because like, oh, the juicy stuff is happening. It was really great because he was growing up. But it basically stops because he's not that old. It's partway to him becoming the person that he is and is going to be. And I want to read that book in 10 or 20 years. So it just, you get the fun Harry Potter anecdotes. Very few of them are that new, especially if you've been on the con circuit, the Harry Potter fan con circuit, or read all of the interviews back in the day. It's fun and light if you are a Harry Potter fan. But yeah, it just kind of is like, fine, because it just didn't quite get there on the depth. But if he writes another book in 10 to 20 years, I will read it. The next one is also just dorky things that fascinate me. I love the Spice Girls. Who doesn't love the Spice Girls? I read The Sporty One by Mel C, and it was fantastic. Just so good. I definitely didn't appreciate Mel C when the Spice Girls were the Spice Girls. I was like the most basic teenage girl ever to exist, and Baby Spice was my favorite. Loved Emma Bunton. She was the youngest. She felt the most relatable. She was pretty and aspirational. We all wanted to be like her. Mel C's great. First of all, I love her voice. I love her accent and just her anecdotes. She just is a genuine, real person, and she talks, she gives you all the tidbits you want. becoming the Spice Girls, living together. She, you know, it's not so much tea, but she's definitely honest and frank while still being circumspect, you know, respectful of everyone, because they're, you know, they all respect each other and they're all friends more or less. But you get all the, you know, the good industry stuff, and she gets into, like, you know, post Spice Girls and how hard it was and how rough the industry can be. I actually was a big fan of Mel C's solo career. It was kind of blowing up when I was living in Germany as an exchange student. She made some great club bangers. I really loved that stuff. So I enjoyed all the post Spice Girl stuff in the memoir. She's honest, funny. She's got great anecdotes. She like edges around drama while being respectful of everyone, which is the most you can ask from a memoir where someone is still friends or wants to be respectful of the people who they interacted with. Solid, great memoir, and one of my favorite parts is that she narrated it, and I love her accent so much. So if you are also a Spice Girls fan, you have 90s nostalgia, it is a fantastic nostalgic memoir for that era into kind of the 2000s of pop, and I really liked it. Okay, we're nearing the end. Got a couple more I liked, but some also controversial takes, kind of, on some very popular memoirs. So let's start with mild controversy. I read Mean Baby by Selma Blair, and this is another one similar to Matthew Perry's memoir, but for different reasons, similar-ish reasons, where I wasn't completely comfortable reading it. I didn't love it. There was something off about it, missing reasons, similar to Britney Spears's and Matthew Perry's in some places, where just like, I'm sure there are good reasons for it, but I felt like there were just parts where something was missing and I wasn't, the context was missing, I wasn't getting the full story, or, you know, the teller, Selma Blair, wasn't fully ready to talk about something, or would maybe never be ready to talk about something, and where you're just reading something and you're like, I think if you ask the other person in this story for their version, you'd hear a different story. That's what I mean when I say missing reasons. And I got it in this book and I got it in those other books. But also just generally, another one similar to Molly Shannon, where aspects of her childhood are just really uncomfortable. And I felt like a voyeur in a bad way. And that again is gonna be my personal like feel. I don't always feel comfortable when I read about people where they clearly had messed up stuff in their childhood, but they've completely normalized it. That's the nicest way to put it. And Britney Spears' memoir did the same thing, where they kind of lampshade acknowledged that technically they know it wasn't the best, but they at the same time totally normalize messed up stuff in their childhood. And so I don't always enjoy being in that headspace, and it's 100% a personal opinion. So this is another one where it was fine. I mean, the title of it, Mean Baby, is literally lampshading. You know, she's got a sense of humor about her life, but I still felt like some of her stories about like Hollywood and the industry were missing something. So yeah, it just wasn't my favorite. I know it's a popular one. People really like it because it's like, you know, wry and funny, but it was not my favorite. On the total opposite end, loved Open Book by Jessica Simpson. She's an open book. Does what it says on the tin. A really good read, spills tea. If you want the celebrity memoir that really tells you the things, Jessica goes in. She gets into it with John Mayer and Johnny Knoxville on opposite ends of the spectrum. She is still quite fond of Johnny Knoxville, but still tells you why their relationship was really messed up. She is an open book. She tells you all the things about her dad and her childhood and struggling with her weight and her relationships and the shit people would say about her and how she felt about things and her issues with alcoholism and dealing with that. She's an open book. It is a fantastic memoir. The only thing that is slightly funny for me about it is that I read it now a couple years ago. This took so long to make this video. But also, even when I read it, it had been out for a few years. And it's a thing where seeing Jessica in the media over the last year or so, and having read the memoir and kind of where she left the memoir, I definitely how much can you have concern for a celebrity who you don't know? At what point is it weird? But I hope she's okay. That's all I have to say, because she does get very raw about a lot of things in her memoir. And you know, she has a lot that she has to deal with. Similar to the Sporty One, if you also have that 90s, early 2000 eras pop nostalgia, read Open Book by Jessica Simpson. Really, I'd say that's a double cocktail. For like the British Spice Girls-y side, read The Sporty One by Mel C and read Open Book by Jessica Simpson. Just a perfect pairing for all that 90s nostalgia. Yeah, Open Book, it's like a 5-star read. I actually think it's a great starter celebrity memoir when people are like, what should I read? I think it's a pretty good one, because so often with celebrity memoirs, they're not as candid as Jessica is. She has that perfect balance of she's emotionally open and candid and is able to say things about like even her own parent, being kind of frank about some of the messed up stuff in her like early career and childhood. She is open and raw about terrible things that were done to her and things that people said about her, and gives you the celebrity tea. I mean, what else can you ask for? It is a fantastic celebrity memoir. And now the time has come to talk about the memoir of the last few years. Still more or less the memoir of the moment, the one that everyone talks about, the one that got a ton of people, millions of people, into reading memoirs who clearly had not read memoirs before. And I actually made a TikTok giving them recommendations. It is my most viewed TikTok of all time. I still get views and comments on that TikTok. And a lot of the books I talked about in this video, I recommended to people to read in addition to that memoir. And in that spirit, I'm gonna tell you what I thought about it, about I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jennette McCurdy. And then I'm going to tell you about my reread that I got this itch that Jennette McCurdy's memoir kind of like, it's not a wound. It's like, it gave me, I read Jennette McCurdy's memoir. I went, that was very good, but we're going to talk about the but. I'm going to reread this perennial favorite of mine that is everything I want and love and adore in a memoir. I'm gonna talk to you about it too, because I think you should all read it. It is actually my #1 rec for people who liked I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jennette McCurdy, though my second one is Open Book by Jessica Simpson. I think those two are really good recs. So I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jennette McCurdy. This was not a runaway 5-star read for me, shockingly. And it is for a lot of people. Not because it was bad. It wasn't bad. I really liked it. It is a great memoir. Starting at the top, Jennette McCurdy is a phenomenal writer. My biggest takeaway from her memoir was she needs to write books, like really write books. And she is. She's working on fiction. Thank God. She is gifted, like really talented. It's one where you don't doubt for a second that she wrote her own memoir. She's incredibly talented, and I cannot wait to see where she goes with it. And I would like her to write another memoir. My thing with I'm Glad My Mom Died is that it feels like half of a memoir. Same thing as with like Tom Felton. This is going to be a pitfall when you are a young person, a young celebrity, and you write your memoir early. And that doesn't mean don't write your memoir early. I'm glad she wrote this memoir. I'm glad she wrote it when she wrote it. But I want to read the book she writes in 10 years. I want to read the book that she writes in 20 years as therapy continues to work for her. Because essentially what I think is important to know when you're going into this book, if you haven't yet read it, is she wrote it when she was 1 or 2 years into recovery from eating disorder, a very serious eating disorder, and therapy unpacking everything from her mom dying and an incredibly abusive childhood. So you're essentially like, she's so young. She's like 30? She's very young. You're basically like a large chunk of this memoir, she's in it. She's in the toxicity. She's in the abuse. She is in the eating disorder. And her coming out of it and being on the other side is like 2 or 3 chapters at the very end of the book. And they're my favorite. I got there. I was like, I loved those chapters so much. And I didn't want the book to end. I wanted it to keep going, but time ran out. Like, time is finite. And it, she caught up to the point where she was writing it. In a normal memoir, by typically an older person, that's the midpoint. Basically, the end of I'm Glad My Mom Died is the midpoint in your average memoir. And I thought that that's what it was building to. It actually does have a before and an after. It's structured that way. It's like an arc. But the stuff at the end should be the midpoint, essentially. So that's why I want to read what she writes in the future as she continues to kind of unpack this and grow as a person and do advocacy work, or even just the impacts of her speaking out about this at all. Like, she's already had such an enormous impact, and I'm so glad this book exists. The thing with the actual book itself, it is also not a traditional memoir, and I think that's important for people to know as well. I think this memoir should come with content warnings. I mean, that's really not controversial. Obviously, for abuse. Jennette writes it in first person, present tense. You are in it with her. She did this incredible job putting herself back in that perspective. And I'm like, oh God, just the process of writing the book must have been so painful for her. You were in the moments with her. And she writes it with the thoughts that she had at the time, not with hindsight and context. And typically when you're reading these memoirs, you get little doses of that. Colton Haynes is actually a great example where he did that. As he is writing about his abuse when he was a child, he gives you those snippets of his child mind and what he thought, but he also gives you a little bit of the hindsight of what he now knows as an adult. And it's like blended together. That's typical for memoirs. So if you've only read I'm Glad My Mom Died, Jennette McCurdy's memoir is simply not a typical memoir. And so when you're reading the heavy stuff, you're also getting the hindsight. You're getting some of the analysis with the heavy. This is first person perspective. You're in it. You're in the abuse. You're in the eating disorder. If you have an eating disorder, if you're in recovery and you are not in a really good place, I can't recommend this book. This has all been in my Goodreads review because I could see it triggering someone. It is so vivid, and you're right there with Jennette, but damn. And then, later in it, she comes on the other side, but when you're in it, you're in it. And it's effective. I think that's why the book was so impactful. She shows you from a first person perspective what things were like and how she felt about them at the time, and then starts to deconstruct them in the back half of the book. And you get the same mind warp that she had in real life, essentially, later when she sees her mother differently after her mother died, which is where the title of the memoir comes from. It is incredibly powerful. Again, I liked it. It's just not an all-timer for me, and I wanted more, which we'll get later. She just needs to continue writing books. So that is like my caveat to people. This is not a typical memoir. She is also walking a tightrope of legal. Brilliantly, mind you, but you have to bear that in mind. It's the emotional candor of it is incredible. It's hyped for a reason, but this isn't your typical tea-spilling memoir. She's thoughtful and respectful. She keeps it very much to her personal emotional journey. And that relationship with her mom, yeah, it's a lot. And I did the audiobook, like many people, and she's fantastic. She gets emotional reading it, and your heart breaks. It is emotional. You'll cry. You'll laugh. She's funny too. But yeah, it is an incredible book. Don't get me wrong. But that was the thing for me holding it back in terms of what I really love in a memoir. And when you hear me talk about memoirs, I like that balance. I like that hindsight. I like it when it's someone in their 40s or their 50s or their 60s really reflecting back. Though obviously there's a place for people who are younger writing memoirs, but this one and a couple of the other ones, same pitfall, where it's just getting good and then it ends because they've caught up to themselves in time. So I still really liked it. Those are my thinky thoughts. When I finished it, I immediately was like, I'm gonna reread the memoir that just hits it out of the park for me. I've talked about this memoir a lot. I've talked about it in my TikTok. I actually mentioned it in a piece for Crime Reads last year when I was nominated for the Edgar Award, and the author saw it, followed me on Instagram, and DM'd me. I died. It was great. So Nellie Olson from Little House on the Prairie knows who I am. How weird is that? That said, okay, so the book that I recommend to everyone, if you like celebrity memoirs or you just trust my taste in books, you have to read Confessions of a Prairie Bitch by Alison Arngrim. I have read it twice now. I read it originally years and years ago on ebook, and I did it on audio after reading Jennette McCurdy's memoir, and I love it even more. It is so good on audio because Alison reads it. She is hilarious, amazing writer. So I've never even seen Little House on the Prairie. That's the funny thing. And I recommend this on Reddit a lot too. And I recommended it on some thread, and someone was like, yeah, but you have to like be a fan of Little House on the Prairie to read that memoir. I was like, I've never seen a single episode. Love it. Read it twice. And so obviously if you are a fan of Little House on the Prairie, it's a must read. Like, she is so much fun, and like essentially the thesis of it, she was a child actor. Her parents were in the business too, which is what you get like a little bit of old Hollywood from it. Not old Hollywood, like 50s and 60s era Hollywood from it, which I really enjoy that era of Hollywood and reading books about it. And then she became a child actor, and she was the villain on Little House on the Prairie. And she talks about kind of like learning to embrace that a lot of people hate her. Not like, I mean, hopefully not really, but that she gets very extreme reactions from people because she is the villain on this beloved children's show that ran for a really long time, and that she you know, learned to embrace that she was famous for playing a bitch. And she has such a good sense of humor about it. And, you know, the memoir is very funny, but some very serious shit went down in her life. So her mom was a voice actor. She was the voice of Gumby and Casper the Friendly Ghost in the cartoons back in the day. How cool. And her dad was in showbiz as well. I think he was a talent manager, like an agent. One fascinating fun fact, she's Canadian. Her parents were from Canada. Her dad was gay, and her mom knew it and totally fine with it. They had like a marriage of convenience. And like, just, so she talks about that and how like, you know, yeah, it was just, you know, her dad was gay. This is how, she had a gay dad. That's how it was. Content warning. Alison is a CSA survivor, and she talks about it in the book. I'm just getting chills thinking about it. This book, you will laugh and you will cry. It is one of those books. Like, it is so heartbreaking and painful. She is a CSA survivor, and it was a family member, and she talks very openly about it and about the pain of, you know, cutting this person out of her life, and, you know, the reactions of other people. And she's an advocate for survivors, and she was battling this and dealing with this while she was one of the most famous child stars in the world. But she still balances some heartbreaking, it's so good. I can barely talk about it, with anecdotes, and it's funny, and she's refreshing, and she did tons and still does tons of advocacy work for the AIDS Foundation. And she's just, you know, I don't know her, though maybe I could because she followed me on Instagram, but I like her so much, and it is just such a good book. She's a brilliant writer. She balances that emotionality and the kind of like the anecdotes, the fun anecdotes, with a lot of heart and humor. And it's one of my favorite memoirs of all time. It's 5 stars. It's a reread. I will read it again. I recommend it to everyone. If you loved I'm Glad My Mom Died, you need to read it. It is just such a good memoir. So that's not bad. I think that I just got through like 18 books. This video is probably fairly long, but my wrap-ups are usually this long for like 12 books. So I'm feeling pretty good about myself. So I want to know, I'm sure lots of you read lots of these. Down in the comments, do you agree with any of my hot takes? Are you like scandalized by my hot takes? Do we want to talk about the Todger chapter for Spare? I don't know. Heck, recommend more celebrity memoirs to me. I genuinely love them. I will keep reading them. I just finished the Colton Haynes ones, and I'm reading another one. I just didn't want to wait to make this video. So yeah, there's a book wrap up for you as requested. I did a thing. I made another video. This is one of my favorite subgenres of books, so I'm always happy to talk about it. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, guys, happy reading.